Hi, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about atheism today, which I believe is yesterday's news. It's something that I believe it will have its downfall when people start looking under the tablecloth of atheism and trying to figure out exactly what is it good for and why are people atheists. And so the atheist is a person who, if we use the traditional definition, it's a person who does not believe in God or believes that God does not exist. And there are people today, especially since Antony Flew came around and decided to popularize the idea that rather than say they don't believe in God, they want to take the view that they lack a belief in God. So there's the lack of belief atheist too. And the reason why people say they lack the belief is because they feel that that suddenly shifts the burden of evidence over to the theist, who says now the theist must prove that God exists. And so I honestly believe that you can look outside in nature and you can look into the cosmos and make a very good case for God's existence. And so, oh, did it start in the middle of my sentence? So I'm sorry if it did. I don't know why that did that. So I want to say thank you to Susan for pointing out that there's a little bit of a glitch right here. But anyway, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some quotes that I have from the atheists and what we want to learn from it. But before we do that, we're going to talk about C.S. Lewis. Now, C.S. Lewis was an atheist, and he spent his early part of his life as an atheist. And he realized after looking into it and looking at the idea of justice, which we're going to talk about in just a second, but he said atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Of course, we know that humans seek meaning. We seek purpose. And if meaning is just a silly quest with no substance, why do we universally seek meaning? So we'll talk about that. Here's what Richard Dawkins says. And I want to make sure that this is transferring to you guys so you can see it. So, oh, yes, it is. Okay. So, hi, Christian Resistance. Hi, Slam RN, of course. It's great to see you guys. And so, I wanted to be sure that I've got this on my other thing here. So, let me just get to that. Okay. So, yeah. So, here's what Richard Dawkins says. And he says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties that we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Of course, this is a very flawed view. And one of the reasons it's flawed is because we know that we can see design in the universe. You can see that one of the reasons that people who study the universe and study the cosmos are able to come up with mathematical computations that very rationally spell out exactly what we see in the universe, looking at the cosmological constant and another number of other constants. One of the reasons we can actually compute these mathematics, looking at the universe and looking at different expectations that we have, is because there is a design. We also see a design in our DNA, but I'll get into that in just a moment. The other thing about his view is it unfortunately leads to nihilism. So Richard Dawkins is a moral relativist. He's also someone who takes atheism very seriously because his view is very consistent with what atheism is. Atheists believe that there is no higher purpose, greater cause, or any sort of God behind everything. And one thing that atheists do, and I just listened to the Christian Resistance's channel today, and he had some great people on there, including Sarah Salviander. And Sarah made a pretty interesting observation. Now, she is, of course, an astrophysicist. She was raised as an atheist, and she came to Christianity. And one of the reasons she came to Christianity is she realized that Christianity explains so much. If we look at the big picture on all of the explanations that Christianity offers for us in life, and we put that all together, we are given a theistic perception. She said a lot of atheists, what they'll do is they'll nitpick some little teeny minor detail. Like, for example, they'll look at the argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, and they'll pick through one of the premises rather than looking at the big picture. Why is it that we have basically a zillion explanations for God? When we look at all of these together, we look at the teleological argument, this idea of purpose and design. We look at the cosmological argument, looking at the start of the universe. We look at our origins. We look at meaning, morality, destiny. All of these kinds of questions can be well answered through the theist. Now, Pine Creek Doug, here's what he says. He says, there is no good reason for atheism. I agree with Pine Creek Doug. Pine Creek's an atheist himself, but he realizes there's no good reason. Here's what Pine Creek Doug also said. He said 85% of atheists don't want to believe Christianity is true. Now think about this, 85%, and I'm not sure exactly how Pine Creek Doug made this assessment. He made an entire video on this titled 85% of atheists don't want to believe Christianity is true. Now, why is that? What is your guess that 85% of atheists don't want to believe it? Well, to some extent, some of them might not want to be held accountable. Okay, the Christian God is a highly just God, highly just Lord, but also merciful. In fact, one of the things that Jesus did was he reconciled on the cross on Calvary God's perfect justice with his perfect mercy when he took the bullet for us, for our sins. So I also want to say hi to people in the chat. I also see Craig Reed, of course, Josh, Christian Resistance, he's in there. Susan is in there, Ear Review also. So it's great to see you guys. So the issue is, if you don't want to believe something, then no matter what the evidence provided, you're just not going to believe it. And that's one of the flaws of this sort of view, saying you just don't want something to be true. So you'll look at all of the evidence that people provide you and you'll take stuff seriously. I look at people who, for example, Kip Davis's video on Psalm 22. He is he's micro analyzing one teeny little word in Psalm 22. And he's decided that that's the word he's going to focus on, whether the word means that Jesus was pierced or whether the word means that like a lion, right? So there's this one word, ka'ari versus ka'aru. Now, Kip Davis, I look at people, when I cited all of the information coming from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the support we have for the word pierced or bore a hole or dug, when I look at all of that, and he is still able to just look past that. And it's kind of like this idea where they just don't want to believe it. No matter how much evidence you provide, how much objective evidence you provide, some people just don't want to believe. So Sam Harris, here's what he says. Our sense of our own freedom results from our not paying attention to what is actually like to be what we are. The moment we do pay attention, we begin to see that free will is nowhere to be found, and our subjectivity is perfectly compatible with this truth. Thoughts and actions simply arise in the mind. What else could they do? The truth about us is stranger than many suppose. The illusion of free will is itself an illusion. I think Sam freely typed his book, The Moral Landscape, and I think that he's claiming that that was just merely a brain fart. His thoughts just simply arose in his mind. So I think it's really a dubious position to be taking, that there's no free will. Let's unpack this a little bit. So some Calvinists believe that there's a theological determinism, which is saying that God determines all of our actions, and therefore we don't have any free will. Everything's been predetermined by God. Then there are people who take the Sam Harris position, which is what they call biological determinism. Sam Harris believes that our biology or our DNA, everything has already been predetermined. All of our actions are pretty much written in our cells. Of course, this is a very simplistic view, and it doesn't take into account whether or not actions are structured, unstructured, routine, non-routine, high level or low level. At a very basic level, a very low level, sure, some of our actions seem like they're pre-planned. You get up, you walk to the breakfast table, you sit down, you don't think too much about it. Some of that could be something that's just sort of in your DNA. It's become a habit. Or the idea of higher level decisions, which is where I'm talking about the non-routine, unstructured decisions, such as asking the question of whether or not God exists, and also answering that question and considering verses like Joshua 24:15. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So the question of free will, in my view, we do have free will. The Bible makes that clear. The Bible says right in that Joshua 24:15, for example, you can choose which gods you want to worship, but as for me and my house, we will choose the Lord. We have choices, and we can make our choices, and we make our own beds, and we're held accountable for it. I think one of the reasons that some atheists want to pretend that we don't have any free will and that everything's predetermined is because they don't want to be held accountable for their actions. They want to blame it all on their genes, their lineage, their parents, their grandparents, their great grandparents. Yeah, sure. But you are held accountable. Sorry, folks. I just have to let that known. So, Mr. Phil Fox, welcome here. Good to see you. So Sam Harris, he also says, despite our perennial bad behavior, our moral progress seems to be unmistakable. I find this really interesting to say our moral progress is unmistakable. The question is, how is moral progress defined? So if we go to our history and we look at our past century, communists slaughtered 120 million people. Okay, 120 million people were killed in the last century. If we're progressing, we certainly shouldn't see those sorts of slaughters. We shouldn't see what we saw during World War II either, where 7 million people were slaughtered. We shouldn't see what we're seeing right now since 1973 in the United States. 60 million US babies have been aborted. Okay, abortion itself is proof that unfortunately our moral progress is not getting any better. Okay, it is an issue. Right now, about 28 million babies die every year because they're considered inconvenient to their mothers. So 28 million is a significant number. You consider that's about 6 times the population of Ireland. Ireland has about 5 million people. 60 million, that's about the size of Italy, okay? We are slaughtering a significant portion of the world just because they're inconvenient. That's certainly not something that could point to moral progress. But one of the reasons that I can say there's certain aspects that we can point out that are beneficial are some of the Western influences on value. The idea that life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness here in the United States, these are all valued. Life is valued, despite people telling you that babies have no worth if they're inside the womb, or they're not persons until some magical point during the pregnancy when they suddenly are conferred personhood, according to the courts. Give me a break. Babies are conceived, and the life begins at the point of conception. It doesn't begin at some magical point later. A baby's life begins at conception. Ask any scientist that. So the fact that we're slaughtering 28 million babies per year speaks to the fact that we've got some deprivation going on, which is pretty sad. So I want to say hi again to people in the chat. Good seeing you guys. I also see Proverbs 15:33, D Proverbs. So good to see you. So here's a few reasons why atheism is untenable. So it cannot explain our origins, our meaning, our morality, our destiny, or our purpose. The nice thing about Christianity is it neatly explains every single one of these very serious and important issues. If somebody tries to pretend evolution explains our origins, they're wrong. It doesn't. Okay. In fact, Cy Gart today on the Christian Resistance's channel also pointed to the serious issue that evolution does not explain our origins. Okay. Evolution explains how life changes, how life adapts. It of course presupposes life exists in the beginning. And evolution needs life to explain life. Okay. It needs to have life. So it doesn't explain our origins. Rather, it explains adaptations of life. So it's circular to try to pretend that evolution explains our origins. It does not. So he is a scientist, he's a biologist, and he can certainly speak to that with authority. Atheism cannot explain the fact that we seek meaning and purpose. We want a greater purpose, and we find that all throughout. We see that in multiple studies where people are seeking purpose. We see that in the workplace. Studies have shown that people succeed in the workplace when they feel like they have a greater purpose, a greater cause. And of course, Christianity helps to explain that. Christianity also explains our morality. You ask the question where these ideas came from. If we're just mere blobs, and we're lucky beneficiaries of some sort of random processes in the universe that generated human life somehow random processes. And the humans decided that now we need to be moral. We need to value justice, fairness. We need to value life. We need to value benevolence. We need to value generosity. We need to value a lot of different sorts of things. Where did all of this come from? if we're just mere random blobs. In fact, we're delusional, according to the atheist, in that we have these moral values because atheism does not explain where they came from. Christianity explains the fact that we have objective morality, and we have this objective morality that is a standard against which we can judge actions. So we have an objective morality, moral duties to be just and to be kind and to be fair. And where did these objective moral duties come from? Well, they came from an objective moral lawgiver. It makes a lot of sense. Now, since these objective moral duties to be fair, just, kind, loving, all of those different other good things, to be right with our neighbors, to do right for our neighbors, where did this all come from? If it transcends generations, it transcends cultures, it transcends people. So the next question that follows is, what transcendent source has imbued us with morality? And of course, that the answer is quite simple. It's God. God not only imbued us with morality, but he also gave us a conscience. So if we violate morality that he's imbued us with, we feel it in our conscience. Our conscience is like that Jiminy Cricket sitting on our shoulder, letting us know we've done something wrong. One of the things you can't get away from is your conscience. So you know when you deny God, even though you see God in the cosmos and you see him in nature, you know when you deny God that you're doing something wrong and it's in your conscience. Atheism also cannot explain why we all suffer at some points in our lives. Everybody is going to have a life of suffering. There's tribulations. But Jesus told us to take up our crosses. He said, in this world you will have trouble, but be of good cheer. He's overcome the world. Jesus let us know through his own example that he took up his cross for us. And he showed us that we're going to have to take up our crosses too. So we all suffer. The interesting thing that I've mentioned before, but I'll say it again, is if you look at studies like the Globe study, which was put out by people such as Robert House and other academics, dozens of other academics around the world, actually. So this study collected data from over 60,000 people. And they looked at countries that have the highest levels of suffering, the poorest people, highest levels of infant mortality, a lot of other metrics that speak to greater suffering and poverty. And they looked at countries that had the lowest levels of suffering, places where there's a lot of wealth and a lot of social safety nets. And they found that the levels of what they call humane orientation, which relates to benevolence, being kind to your neighbors and being kind to even outsiders. They collected a word benevolence to speak to humane orientation to capture both being kind, not only just to your in-group, but also to your out-group and to animals and the environment. They realized that the highest levels of humane orientation come from places where there's greater suffering. So a lot of African countries have higher levels of humane orientation. And the lowest level is in West Germany, what was formerly West Germany. Okay, Germans unfortunately have the lower levels. And so do other European countries have these lower levels of humane orientation. You see, if you're in a country that has a lot of social safety nets, and you've essentially outsourced taking care of the poor to the government, which you see in a lot of these Northern European and Western European countries, where they have very high social safety nets, cradle to grave, taking care of people, taking care of you, at all these different things, outsourcing the work with the poverty, the impoverished, to the government, you tend to see lower levels of humane orientation. Think about that and why that is. It's one of the drawbacks of having a lot of social safety nets. One of the things in the United States is we don't outsource that. We still rely on churches and synagogues and mosques and others to help take care of the poor. And we also rely on different humane organizations and charities. In fact, the people in the United States are known as some of the biggest givers in the world. And a lot of the giving goes to people whom they've never met. People give very, very cheerfully across the world, funding orphanages in other countries and places like that where they've never even been. And so my point overall here is that when we see great suffering, a lot of times you might feel that there's no purpose for that. But God's in the process of soul building. And so in places where there's tremendous suffering, a lot of times these are very strong spiritual people. And so we can see that. Now, interestingly, one of the places that has high studies, oh, Kim would like to have a link to those studies. Yeah, it's the Globe study, Kim. GLOBE study. Just type in Robert House Globe study and you'll be able to access that information on humane orientation. It's also in a book. It was written in 2004 and it's called The Globe Study. And so, in fact, let me just get that. Let me get that Globe study for you so you can see what it is. Globe study across 62 societies. So here is the link. Let me just, whoops. So here's the study. It's called Culture, Leadership, and Organizations. So the Globe study. And so let me just get this for you. Hold on one second. Try to put this in the chat. Okay, so I also want to mention something about the suffering is really interesting. So in Ireland happens to be one of the places that has higher levels of humane orientation. And some might wonder, how is that? How is Ireland? Well, Ireland tends to be very Christian. Lots of Catholics, and in Northern Ireland, of course, Protestants. But Ireland is a very Christian place. John Lennox, who's Irish, has also pointed that out, that a lot of people wonder, why are the Irish such Christians? They definitely are endorsing Christianity, Christ, all that kind of good stuff. And what's interesting is in the 1800s, the Great Potato Famine occurred in Ireland, and its population shrunk from about 8 million people to about 5 million people today. And at the time shrunk to 5 million, and they've just been staying around 5 million people since then. That's puny if you realize the size of Ireland is about a quarter of the size of the state of Florida, population-wise. So it's kind of an interesting thing. But the Irish tend to have very high levels of humane orientation. So it could also go hand in hand with religiosity, especially intrinsic religiosity. So another thing that atheism cannot explain is why our conscience nags at us when we do our fellow humans wrong. Okay, this idea of a conscience, where did that come from in the atheist mentality? Okay, how are the atheists going to explain that we have a conscience? Okay, and I'm just noticing I have conscious. I meant conscience. So our conscience nags at us. So let me just change that really quickly. So our conscience nags at us when we do the wrong thing. So we can go to Romans 2:15 and see some of that. Okay, and then the next thing I want to point out are other reasons atheism is untenable. And so Susan says an interesting conversation to be had one day is how people who hold to high social justice values also score low on truth telling as a value. Ooh, super interesting, Susan. If you've got a link to that, I'd like to see that. Very, very interesting. I can show you. I'm gonna go on a little divergence here to get into what you're saying, because I do have some evidence on kind of something similar to that. So I tended for many years, I was voting Democrat, and I tended to lean to the left. And I happened to find my own study. I had a study and I was collecting people's political values, and I was also collecting their scores on the 5-factor model of personality. Now, the 5-factor model is an acronym, OCEAN. So it's openness to change, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And I found in my study that people who were Republicans had higher levels of conscientiousness. Conscientiousness. What am I saying? What's the word I'm looking for? Oh my gosh, I'm just losing my words here all of a sudden. So people who had higher scores on in the C, why am I forgetting that all of a sudden? I'm going to have to. I'm doing a brain thing here. So people who had scores in. Let me just. Okay, let me get the word. Consciousness. Okay, so people who had higher scores in consciousness, conscientiousness, those people tended to have, those people tended to be more Republican. Okay, so what does that mean? People who are conscientious tend to be, so I'm for some reason I'm thinking, but people who are more conscientious tend to be very focused on doing the right thing, doing the right job, working very hard, putting in the effort, being achievement striving. And the Republicans in my study had higher levels. And so I didn't publish that particular portion of the study because, of course, I was leaning to the left and I didn't really like those views. However, I found out since then that numerous studies, all kinds of studies, have found that Republicans have higher scores in conscientiousness than others. Okay, so they've got the higher scores. And so that's just something to think about. And so that could speak to this idea of truth telling. All right. So telling the truth, and people who tend to be advocating for a lot of these social justice cause and social justice has gotten a bad name because it sounds like it's a good deal to be socially conscious, and focus on being just. But a lot of times it's to the expense of different groups. A lot of times it's based on people's group identity. A lot of times people are demonizing one group over another group, pretending that we all are racist and all this kind of stuff if we are just born with a certain color skin. So that kind of thing is where it's gone wrong. So, okay. So another thing, atheism and Susan, you're going to be excited. I've got you in this slide. Hopefully you can see it. So atheism also cannot explain the miracles we still witness today. And I put in parentheses here, we've talked before about Barbara Kaminsky Snyder, amazing miracle. My child get up and walk, and she was cured of her MS. Susan, who's in the chat. Susan is also another example of a miracle. She was on her deathbed in hospice. You don't go to hospice unless you're on your deathbed. And she's here today. And she had a very distinct feeling that she was going to be cured. And she was. Okay. Pastor David McGuire, he's been on my channel too. He also had an experience where a lot of the mental issues that he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, coming from fighting in the war. Of course, he's a soldier, a veteran, and his post-traumatic stress, mental issues that he was having, those all went away. He was having horrible dreams, nightmares, all kinds of bad stuff, and that went away. And so that's just something to think about. Atheism also can't explain how consciousness came about in the world. How did that come about? Okay, so that's just something to think about. And it also can't explain our apprehension of beauty in nature and art, the cosmos, and people. You see, atheism or even science can't really explain beauty and the way that we can get awestruck by seeing beautiful mountains or beaches or other beautiful scenes here in the world. Some of the scenes like the aurora borealis up in the northern hemisphere, absolutely beautiful skies, and we get awestruck in that kind of stuff. Atheism can't explain that, and it can't explain how we seek beauty and we appreciate nature, art, cosmos, people, and music. Okay, all that kind of good stuff. So here's another reason that atheism is untenable. So it's untenable because of near-death experiences. Just something to think about. Those vary from one person to another, and they often include these features. So what's really interesting on the studies on near-death experiences is some of the similarities between these different experiences. Like, here's some similarities that were pointed out. Now, this is University of Virginia medical studies, and so this is a research done out of there on near-death experiences, and here's what they found were some commonalities. They vary from one person to another, but they often include these features: feeling very comfortable and free of pain, a sensation of leaving the body, sometimes being able to see the physical body while floating above it. My mom had that happen when she was giving birth to me. She actually was sort of floating above her body, watching the nurses take care of her. The mind functioning more clearly and more rapidly than us. A sensation of being drawn into a tunnel or darkness. And then a brilliant light, sometimes at the end of the tunnel. A sense of overwhelming peace, well-being, or absolute unconditional love. A sense of having access to unlimited knowledge. A life review or recall of important events in the past. A preview of future events to come. And sometimes people encounter their deceased loved ones or other beings that may be identified as religious figures. Of course, people like Jesus. And so we see some pretty fascinating stuff right there. So I want to say hi also in the chat to Nathan and Dr. Nose and Praise I Am. So we got some good people in the chat. So here's what Scientific American, an article from there says. It says, NDEs are not fancy flights of the imagination. They share broad commonalities: becoming pain-free, seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, and other visual phenomena, detaching from one's body and floating above it, or even flying into space. Some of these out-of-body experiences. And so just interesting stuff. So here's another thing about atheism and making it rather untenable. So it cannot explain the way that 3.5 billion letters, which are adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine, A, C, G, and T are sequenced in our DNA code. According to Cy Gart, he says a lot of the atheists these days are trying to argue against having DNA code, even though that's been the terminology used in numerous biological textbooks for decades. We have a DNA code that implies a coder. You wouldn't think that if you saw the words "I love you," and this is coming from John Lennox, written in the sand, were not written by a mind. So why would you think that a sequence of 3.5 billion letters that are well organized in our DNA are something that doesn't come from a mind? They just sort of fell together in place. Seems rather illogical to take this kind of view. It also cannot explain the events surrounding Jesus' crucifixion that are accepted by scholars of all religious and non-religious stripes. One of the problems that I have found with the atheists is when they're given the information from even hostile sources concerning Jesus, they want to take little pieces of it and not look at the big picture. So let's look at the big picture and offer what our best explanation is from these hostile sources, ancient hostile sources. Okay? So tell your mythicist friends, yes, Jesus existed. It's almost embarrassing that people try to make that claim. It's kind of ridiculous, actually. So Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Younger, the Talmud, Maribor Serapion, Suetonius, Thales, Phlegon, Lucian, those are just some extra-biblical, non-Christian sources that have given us information that he existed. Celsus says he claims he was born of a virgin. Celsus also said he lived in Egypt at one point. We, of course, know, out of Egypt I called my son. Jesus went to Egypt. His family fled to Egypt right after he was born because Herod had decided that he was going to issue a decree where he was going to kill everybody younger than 2. His brother was James. Josephus pointed that out. And actually, Josephus also pointed out that James was martyred, and he was a preacher in a Jerusalem temple. So James, who was Jesus's brother, who was one of the only people who would know, of all the people Jesus had as apostles and others, the people who would know whether or not Jesus had sinned would be those closest to him. His brother would know that. And his brother ended up writing one of the books in the New Testament, as did his other brother, Jude. And so they both came to belief. After trying to stop Jesus' ministry, they both turned around because Jesus appeared to them. And we know that Jesus appeared to James, as is outlined in 1 Corinthians 15. Sorcery. They realized he had some miraculous powers. Celsus said that. The Talmud said it was sorcery. Josephus called him a wonder worker. Okay. Josephus also said he was wise, and Maribor Serapion said he was a wise king and teacher. He had knowledge of the future, according to Phlegon. His followers considered themselves brothers, according to Lucian. He claimed to be God, according to Celsus. And he was worshipped as a god by followers, according to Lucian, Pliny the Younger, on a fixed day of the week, according to Pliny the Younger. He was executed and crucified, according to Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Celsus, the Talmud, Maribor Serapion. He died on the eve of the Passover, according to the Talmud. Earthquakes accompanied his death. Now, I can also find that in geological academic studies today. They found earthquakes in the Dead Sea Basin, seismite activity, during the year 33, which is the year that we estimate that he died. Phlegon and Thales also verified that. He was buried in a tomb as per Jewish customs and law to keep the ground pure. They took him off the cross. And as we recall, Joseph of Arimathea, which is pointed out in all 4 Gospels, buried him in his tomb. Joseph was a rich man. And of course, that fulfilled the prophecy from Isaiah that he would be buried in a rich man's tomb. Now, some might say, no, he wouldn't have been buried because he was a bad guy. He was, he was crucified. Obviously, that's a malefactor. But Josephus and Tacitus both point out the Jews even buried the malefactors. The disciples said he appeared to them alive 3 days after the crucifixion, according to Josephus. Christians were martyred, according to Suetonius and Tacitus. Those who refused to recant were martyred. Pliny the Younger told that in his letter to Trajan. And then his followers made an oath not to commit wicked deeds. So you guys take all of this information and try to explain what's going on here. So one of the things that's going on, the question is, what can adequately explain all of this information? So we know that he was crucified, and then 2 of the big pieces here, his disciples appeared to them alive after the crucifixion. Then his disciples went out and they preached for Jesus for decades, despite being persecuted. We know in the book of Acts, we had Stephen, who was the very first martyr. He was stoned. We had James, the brother of John and son of Zebedee. He also was martyred in the book of Acts. We have very good support for Peter, James, and Paul, the apostle, having also been martyred in the 60s, right around the 60s. Got very good extra biblical support for that. So why am I pointing that out? Because they all had, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. He was hiding when Jesus was going through the crucifixion. You have Paul, who was preaching against Christianity, and then he had his road to Damascus vision. And you had James, who tried to stop Jesus. Jesus appeared to all 3 of these people, and they preached for Jesus for decades, despite massive persecution. They didn't care because they realized the next life is what they're striving for. As C.S. Lewis has said, aim at heaven and you get the earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you get neither. Very wise. So, yeah, so I can share these slides, Dr. Nose. If you want to send me an email address or something, I'll just email you my slides. And I've got actually one slide I have. This is my shorter slideshow, but I have a slideshow that has over 100 slides in it with all kinds of evidence that I use when I debate. I haven't debated in a long time, but I've been building up this slide deck for that. If I get in debates, I can just easily shoot through a lot of this information to share with people. And so I can also slide you that if you're interested. So yeah, those are my slides. I did write them up. And so I want to say thank you guys who came in here today. Let me see if anybody else wants to make a comment or thoughts on this. So I see Kim Arnott. I think I saw you, Kim, over on Josh's channel just a little while ago today. And so I think I think maybe he brought you over here. So that's pretty cool. And so, yeah, Dr. Knows I'll gladly send these slides out, though. I'm very, very open to share my slides and my information that I have. And so the bottom line that we have to conclude here is that atheism doesn't explain the big aspects, the big questions in life. It doesn't serve any purpose. It has no hope. It leads to nihilism if you take it to its logical consequences. It's a materialistic view. It believes that essentially spirituality does not exist. Near-death experiences, of course, would be ruled out by the atheist. And of course, they're going to rule out miracles. But our experiences in life and many people's experiences in near-death experiences, and also just the big questions in life that are answered. Origins, meaning, destiny, morality, purpose, all of those good kinds of things are answered through Christianity. Christianity is unique, though, from other religions. Now, how is Christianity unique? Not only because of Jesus Christ himself, and there's no other faith that's quite like that, where the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, but not only because of that, but because we don't earn our way to heaven. Unlike other faiths and philosophies, if you're looking at the Hindu faiths, they believe in reincarnation until you finally reach nirvana. You're constantly being reincarnated into another life form. If you did a really bad job in life, you might be reincarnated into a cow, okay? The sacred cow. If you did a horrible job, it could be some other sentient being, like maybe a rat, okay? You could be reincarnated into some other life form if you did a terrible job on Earth. So you aren't held accountable according to the Hindus and the Buddhists, who adopt the reincarnation way of explaining how life progresses. If you did a great job, then you move up to a different caste in the Indian beliefs. Now, Indians don't endorse the caste system anymore, but of course they all know which caste they're in. They believe you're born into a caste and life's mobility is pretty much impossible, but you have the promise of another life in a higher caste if you do a good job in this life. That's the Hindu and the Buddhist belief in the reincarnation. Now, the Muslims believe that God or Allah is sort of keeping a ledger of all of your actions. So if you have more good actions than bad actions, according to God's ledger, then you're going to be led into heaven and you're going to be around a bunch of virgins who are going to take care of you sexually, apparently, according to the Muslims. Now, that belief system itself just strikes me as rather... anyway, I won't get into that, but that's a system of works-based. Okay, so both the Hindus, I should say not just both, the Hindus, the Buddhists, and the Muslims, these are 3 major world faiths, all endorse a works-based philosophy. But Christianity is unique. Christianity is faith-based. So God extends us an offer of salvation, and through faith, we're given grace. So he extends this offer of salvation to each of us. And so God so loved the world, he gave his one and only son. Whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. And so, yeah, so Susan, good pointing out the idea that strict materialism is incoherent in several ways. It certainly is. It certainly can't explain our consciousness. It can't explain this idea of how we come to it can't explain how consciousness came about in the first place, how suddenly people or animals, sentient beings became aware of their environments. Can't really explain that. And so it also can't explain spirituality. It can't explain the near-death experiences, can't explain miracles. There's lots of stuff like that. And yeah, so Susan, there is a problem that does go on in other parts of the world too, in India as well. And I've talked to a number of Indian students, but this idea of pigmentocracy, where if they were selling these fair and I forget what the name of the cream is that people could put on themselves, but people are trying to make themselves lighter skinned. And so there's definitely something that's going on with that. And yeah, it doesn't explain life. So I want to say thank you to everybody for coming in here today. If you're interested in videos on particular topics, let me know what those topics are. Let me know what you'd like to talk about. And let me know if you'd like me to interview any particular people. I was listening to, again, Cy Gart, Sarah Salviander, and I forgot the name of the third person that was on Josh's channel today, 3 scientists. But I would like to also have some scientists on my channel, so that would be very interesting. Or any of you, if any of you are interested in coming on, I'd love to bring you on here. We can all chat and talk about some of the really exciting things that are happening today in the Christian world and getting the good word out. So thank you. So whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Thank you so much, everybody. You guys have a great day.